Good. Welcome to Introduction to Christian Ethics. I hope that's where you're planning to be this morning. So it is an urgent time to be engaged in the work of Christian ethics. In the face of the durability of structural racism, in the face of rampant inequality, in the face of a rapidly warming climate, and we could go on and on and on. And Christian convictions don't remain neatly sequestered from lived realities. They are embedded in shared practices, in shared rituals, in shared ways of life. There's no tidy line that connects Christian faith, Christian doctrine, to what this means for our lives in the world. Right? There are many ways in which people make these connections and live out their commitments. 2 years ago, which happens to be when I last taught this class, we were still reeling from the reality of the storming of the U.S. Capitol. And one of the things that was, I think, most dumbfounding for me was the visibility of Christian symbols in that storming. And it made me come to terms with the reality of white Christian nationalism in this country. And I think we've been continuing to come to terms with that since that time. And it would be, somehow comforting to be able to say that these were people who were knowingly manipulating Christian symbols and Christian faith in order to gain followers. And there's certainly some of that that's going on. But of course, that's not the whole story, because there are people who are sincere believers, sincere Christians, and who understood their Christian faith to be supportive of what was going on that day at the Capitol. And of course, there are sincere Christians who were and are aghast at the appropriation of the cross and of the Bible for these kinds of things, and who marshal their faith in very different ways, for example, in climate activism. So Christians live out their faith in terms of their ethical commitments in the world in ways that clash with one another, right? So how is it that Christians, reading the same scriptures, celebrating the same sacraments, agreeing that we ought to love our neighbor, arrive at such divergent conclusions concerning what is good and what is right? What does it mean that Christian faith can be invoked so easily to support opposing notions about how to live and how to act? And how should we respond in the face of such profound disagreement? Now, this kind of thing is grappling with the ways in which Christian faith can fund opposing ethical views is on the table for us this semester, thinking through what this means for the life of faith, that it can fund absolutely opposed ethical convictions. Let me just throw out some things that are often associated with ethics. And one of them is you might think in terms of professional codes, say medical ethics or business ethics, the do's and don'ts that go along with being an upstanding member of a particular profession. And those might be highly articulated, that they might be something that you actually subscribe to, you sign on to. I will observe this moral code that when I carry out this profession. But you might say, well, less so something like the Hippocratic Oath in a medical profession. Actually, you might think that ethics is really more fundamentally about universal requirements that don't attach to you just as you're in some particular professional sphere, but that fundamentally ethics is about requirements attaching to your action that hold for everyone, that hold universally. And of course, as soon as you say that, it starts to become complex. Hold maybe for what? All people similarly situated, right? Because situations change, situations matter. And often you can see here I've got a wonderful quote from Immanuel Kant, because Kant is the one most associated with universalizability being the core of moral obligation. Well, you might also think in terms of moral dilemmas or moral quandaries, that this is what goes on when you study ethics, that you think about a train that's hurtling down the track and it will surely kill 5 people who are attached to the track unless you throw the switch, and then it will surely kill the one person who's tied on this track. And that's what ethics classes do, is to puzzle their way through these kinds of moral dilemmas and moral quandaries. And these this kind of thought experiment can work to surface moral intuitions, right? These visceral responses. Oh, no, we can't do that. So they can be helpful in that way in helping us to articulate our responses to situations. But of course, the situations are highly artificial. And so sometimes we hear a strong critique of ethics that's approached through the study of moral dilemmas or moral quandaries, because these situations are not anything like the context in which we ordinarily live our lives. And shouldn't ethics have to do with the way we ordinarily live, and not just with the very rare situation in which we're confronting something like this? The other thing that can be surfaced if you focus on moral dilemmas is a certain kind of moral disagreement. If ethics is supposed to be about universal requirements binding on anyone who's similarly situated, why are there so many disagreements in terms of our moral intuitions? Why don't we not get it? If ethics is about these universal requirements, you would think that we should all be equipped to get it and to agree with one another. So sometimes when you think about ethics, you start quickly to go into the direction of ethical relativism. Well, maybe what's right for me isn't right for you. Maybe what's right for people in my group, in my time, in my place, in my context, maybe that's not what's incumbent on you who are otherwise situated. Maybe capital punishment was okay in that time and place, and it's not okay now. Or maybe polygamy is okay there under these conditions and not okay here. So we need to distinguish ethical relativism from cultural relativism, or from more differentiated forms of relativism, according to which there's still a fact of the matter about whether an action, a way of life, so on, is right or wrong, good or bad. But determining the answer to that is going to require all sorts of substantial information about the specific context. So there's a form of relativism that's really about attention to context and the difference that context makes. And then there's a hard moral relativism, according to which there are no objective moral truths. There is no right or wrong of the matter. There's just different opinions about what's right and what's wrong. So hard moral relativism tends to fall into self-defeating contradiction, because it tends to condemn those who pass judgments on one another. And if it falls into condemning those who pass judgments on one another, then it is itself issuing a moral judgment in the process of saying that one should not issue moral judgments. So moral relativism, it can take these different flavors. I would advise you to try to avoid the kind that falls into self-contradiction, and instead to recognize that there is some insight into the importance of, however universalizable moral judgments may be, attending to the difference that context makes. And that will be often 80% of what ethical reflection involves, attending to whether this particular difference in context has implications for assessing the goodness, the rightness, and so on of a particular action. All right, but so we've been focused primarily thus far in what I've said, and in much of what you've said, on right and wrong, on actions, on analyzing actions. But ethics is actually much, much broader than a focus on whether an action is right or wrong. Ethics is very broadly about how to live. What kind of life is worth living? What kind of person do you want to be? What kind of person do you feel called to be? What kind of society is worth living in? What kind of community is worth advancing? All of these questions are questions that are bound up with ethics. What ends are worth seeking, and how ought they to be sought? So Robin Lovin, who I'll say more about in a moment, he seeks to capture this broad scope of ethical reflection, reaching well beyond the rightness or wrongness of a particular action, by speaking in terms of goals, of duties, and of virtues. That ethical reflection needs to think about all of these, and that the ethics of action tends to focus on this area of duties, of right and wrong actions. But we do well to broaden the scope of our reflection in this way. So what about Christian ethics? This has all been about ethics in general thus far. Well, Christian ethics is asking these broad questions and is asking them in terms of who God is and what God is doing. So what ought we to do? How ought we to live? Who ought we to be and become as individuals, in community? And all of this in relationship, in response to who God is and what God is doing in creating, in redeeming, in consummating. What is God doing, and how are we called to respond in terms of what God is doing in the work of Jesus Christ, what God is doing through the work of the Holy Spirit? Now, if you are a Christian, this is a self-involving enterprise necessarily. Right? There's only so much detachment that can be undertaken that is appropriate when it comes to thinking about these questions. If you're not Christian, this is a more anthropological enterprise, right? It's not so much how ought I to live in response to these realities or in response to these commitments, in response to this way of framing reality, but it's more, how is it that these folk live? How is it that they are called to live? How is it that they understand what is worth doing, being, seeking? So Christian ethics is never merely just a matter of describing how Christians act or describing Christian beliefs about how to act or how to live. It's a normative enterprise. That's what I mean by it's a self-involving enterprise. How should Christians live and act given the way that God is and the way the world is? So Christians don't always agree with one another, obviously, and we will have to confront that again and again, both in what we read, but also in our own bodies, in the space of our classroom, in the space of section, in the space of lecture, because ethics is a self-involving enterprise, and because we're also grappling with faith commitments and what flows from them. We may find ourselves at one time or another getting hot under the collar, right? Getting very engaged in what we're talking about here. And heightened emotion, I want to say, is not a bad thing. It reveals to us what we care about. It can reveal to us what our commitments are. And that is part and parcel of what it is to be an embodied creature. And I have to say, in this time of lots of chatter about Chat GPT and what it can and can't do, I'm thinking we're gonna feel our way into our embodied nature and the embodied character of the work of ethics, which Chat GPT cannot do yet, right? But anyway, heightened emotion. The downside of it is it can make it difficult to listen. It can make it difficult to absorb what others are bringing to the table. And so we'll be working with that. And it's critical in this class that we commit to creating a respectful, supportive environment within which we understand ourselves and one another as beings in process, beings in the context of growth, people who err and people who need need sometimes some moments of grace. And you will look in the syllabus, you will see this statement about our community of learning. And I'll just go ahead and I try not to usually read slides, but let me go ahead and read this particular slide. Our goal as a learning community is to create a safe environment that fosters open and honest dialogue. We are all expected to contribute to creating a respectful, welcoming, and inclusive environment. To this end, classroom discussion should always be conducted in a way that shows honor, respect, and dignity to all members of the class. Moreover, disagreements should be pursued without personal attack and aggression, and instead should be handled with grace and care. This will allow for rigorous intellectual engagement and a deeper learning experience for all. Lastly, please remember to practice self-care, which according to Audre Lorde is not an act of self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. Wonderful quote. So balancing all of these things, right? Balancing our own deep commitment and engagement, which comes along with heightened emotion, balancing that with a commitment to listening and openness, respect for others. And this is an aspirational statement. I hope it's one that you are committed to supporting. Certainly welcome conversation at any point in the semester about this as an expectation and about how you feel that you and others are living into that, and as well as how you perceive me as living into that as well. Your first assignment for this class is a social personal location exercise. It's described in the syllabus on Canvas, and it's due next Monday. And this is really designed as an opportunity for you to lift up into reflective awareness the assumptions, the commitments, the identities that you are bringing to this class, and how you think they may shape your learning in this context. So, and I will say, typically we're less aware of the dimensions of our identities that have to do with the ways in which we are privileged, and we're more aware of those dimensions of identity which are not aligned with privilege and power. So just try to think about that, but really surface whatever you think is most relevant to your learning in this class. This is not asking you to reveal things that are deeply private about yourself. There are other contexts where that might be more appropriate, but I think it can make quite an important difference when you start a semester with this kind of stock taking about what you're bringing into the experience. I will say, touch on this just one more time on Thursday. So if you have any questions about how to approach that, be ready to surface those on Thursday. All right, so just a few words about the design of this course, the way I've put it together, because it might not be immediately obvious from glancing through the syllabus. There are obviously many, many ways to enter into the study of Christian ethics. And this course is not designed to survey the historical development of Christian ethics as a field of reflection. We are engaging with lots of historical material, ranging from the Hebrew Bible up through very, very contemporary texts. And you will be reading a lot of what would often be considered sort of classical thinkers in Christian ethics. But I've not arranged them chronologically, very much on purpose, because doing so has a tendency to center white male European voices. And so I'm deliberately designed it in a different way. So we're spending roughly the first half of the class reflecting on various sources and modes and methodologies for doing ethics and doing Christian ethics, and the second half of the course reflecting on a range of issues of contemporary and historical import. So often when we're approaching a contemporary issue, there will be some much earlier source, and we'll have an opportunity to think about how well this issue today is actually rooted in reflection on that stems from the early modern reflection on property or whatever it is. So there will be opportunities to think about not just what we're facing here and now, but how it's shaped by Christian reflection over centuries. We have two core texts for the class. Robin Levin's Introduction to Christian Ethics, and Katie Geneva Cannon's Black Womanist Ethics. So apart from two sessions devoted to biblical text, Hebrew Bible and New Testament, as sources for Christian ethics, as material for Christian ethics, we'll be engaged for the first 11 sessions or so, either with Levin or with Cannon or with both. So they're just kind of our conversation partners. We'll be reading other things as well, but sort of a conversation partners for that first part of the class. So it's kind of structuring our conversation. And after that, we'll be turning to these issues, use of force, the economy, property, prison abolition, immigration, families, disabilities, environmental justice, and food. And again, the point here is not to give you the Christian view on these issues. It's not to say, okay, I now have a definitive theoretical grasp of these issues. It's to give you practice in thinking Christianly in ethical ways about a range of issues, so that you can leave this course and be equipped to engage with whatever questions and whatever issues are on your particular plate. So it's not about, well, what's included and what's left out. Obviously, you can never include all of the wonderful things that we could be thinking about. So it's always just selective. So just a word about Levin, and then I'll say a word about Katie Geneva Cannon as well. So Robin Levin is an ordained Methodist minister. He was trained at Harvard, taught at Candler School of Theology at Emory, the University of Chicago Divinity School, Drew University Divinity School, and the Perkins School of Theology. So he's experienced a very broad swath of the world of divinity. He ended his career as the director of research at the Center for Theological Inquiry at Princeton. His thought is very deeply shaped by the Christian realism of Reinhold Niebuhr. And if you're familiar with Niebuhr's thought, you'll see that shaping the way that he approaches the study of Christian ethics. He's also a specialist on the social ethics of three other towering 20th century theologians, Barth, Brunner, and Bonhoeffer. So again, you'll see that shaping. We'll discuss how it's shaping the way in which he understands Christian ethics. And I'll say, no introduction to Christian ethics is perfect. Any introduction will reflect specific commitments of the writer, but I think this is a very good one. It's clear, it's capacious. Like our course, it's historically engaged, but it's not structured historically. It lifts up a rich array of voices and perspectives in Christian ethics while offering a coherent, integrated perspective. So it's a good text with which to engage. It's not like I'm not preaching Robin Levin, I'm engaging. We will be engaging with Robin Levin. And then Katie Geneva Cannon, this text, Black Womanist Ethics, is not an introduction to Christian ethics. It's not trying to be an introduction to Christian ethics. Katie Cannon was the first Black woman to be ordained in the United Presbyterian Church, which was among the churches that merged then to form the PCUSA. She was trained at Union Theological Seminary. She got her PhD in 1983. She went on to teach at Temple Episcopal Divinity School, Harvard Divinity School, and Union Theological Seminary, and she died fairly recently in 2018. She is, as I said, not trying to write an introduction to Christian ethics. She is trying to constructively interrupt the enterprise. She's not trying to synthesize. So that's part of what's exciting about bringing these texts together. They're doing very different things, and what happens when we bring them into conversation with one another. The text is from 1988, and she is using this term womanist, which was coined by Alice Walker, and it was mediated primarily through her 1983 text, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. So Cannon was one of the first generation of womanist theologians who claimed this term womanist for what might otherwise have probably been called Black feminist liberation theology, as a corrective and a furthering of Black theology on the one hand and feminist theology on the other. So it was a corrective to white feminism's false universalizing of white women's experiences, and it was a corrective to Black theology's elision of the experiences and voices of Black women. And womanist theology has, since that time, been a key site for the recognition of the intersectional character of oppression based on race, sex, class, gender, and sexuality. So I want to make clear, this is by now a classic text of womanist theology. There's so much exciting work in womanist theology that's gone on since that time. So if we wanted to read the latest, greatest, best thing in womanist theology, we could read Dr. Ebony Marshall Turman. We could read Dr. Carrie Day. I want to assign, in this context, this classic text so we can see womanist theology at its incipient moment, right? And how is it interrupting what's going on, and what is it doing? So as we seek to gain a sense of the landscape, I missed one of Katie Cannon's slides. As we seek to gain a sense of the landscape of Christian ethics, various approaches and methodologies, Cannon obviously represents one option, but it's also a challenge to exercises of tidy mapping, however capacious they may be. At the heart of this challenge is the question of whether what we or others take to be Christian ethics, what we take to be what it means to live in response to what God is doing and has done in Jesus Christ and in the Spirit, really is this, or whether it is simply what Cannon calls dominant ethics, which turns out to be an ethos, a way of thinking and living and being that simply reflects a status quo that is sustaining, in her words, racism, gender discrimination, and economic exploitation. So she is challenging racism, sexism, and economic exploitation, but to be sure, she's challenging even more than this. She's challenging what has been taken to be ethics as such. So we want to come to terms with the radical character of that challenge, but also what it means. So she writes that the real lived texture of Black life requires moral agency that may run contrary to the ethical boundaries of mainline Protestantism. Blacks may use action guides which have never been considered within the scope of traditional codes of faithful living. So we have to listen carefully to this to be clear on what she is critiquing and what she is proposing. So traditional codes of faithful living have been claimed to be, have appeared to be, have been felt to be good and pure and upright, but they have fostered and furthered injustice and oppression. And this can be kind of disorienting. It's disorienting in something like the way that Dostoevsky disoriented by asking, if God is dead, then isn't everything permitted? What happens when you question whether ethics is really right? Is whether everything that, things have been claimed to be the guide to right and wrong have themselves been furthering what is unjust? What if what we have taken to be right and good has been a ruse of a sort, invented by those in power to keep everyone else in their proper subservient place? Or even if not invented on purpose in this way, nevertheless functioning in this way in a very resistant fashion? What if the liberation that is needed is not just a liberation from oppression, but a liberation from ethics itself? While she does not use the language of critical theory in a very different register, this is also a question that is posed by critical theorists. What is taken to be normal and why? Whose interests are served by this way of defining the normal? What power is accrued by taking these measurements and by collecting this data? What possibilities for living are thereby obscured or obliterated? So if, as she puts it, the traditional codes of faithful living, the dominant ethics, come under suspicion, where do we go? How do we proceed? Have we lost our sense of orientation? So it is still necessary to live somehow, right? To respond in some way to the way the world is, to the way one is now understanding reality to be. And I think if we listen clearly, we hear that she is not saying that ethics is dead and now everything is permissible, or that everyone should do whatever they want. No, on the contrary, she is turning the tables in certain respects. She is doing a differentiated critique of certain commitments, right? So racism, gender discrimination, and economic exploitation, she writes, as inherited, age-long complexes require the Black community to create and cultivate values and virtues in their own terms so that they can prevail against the odds with moral integrity. With moral integrity, right? She's claiming moral integrity. She's not throwing it out because that's ethics and we want to throw ethics out. So she still affirms values and virtues of some kind, even though she will question some things regarded as virtues by the dominant ethic. She still seeks moral integrity as something good, as something to be aimed at. So as you read, be very attentive to the specifics. What is she critiquing as the dominant ethic? What is she lifting up as the Black womanist ethic? And on what basis, right? On what grounds? We'll dig into this as we go along. As Robin Lovin notes, ethics never begins in the classroom. It begins as we become aware of what we have up until this point taken to be good and right and just. And we begin to wonder whether it truly is good and right and just. Is the way that we do things really the best way, the right way? Are we justified in judging those who deviate from our way of doing things? These questions might begin in a classroom, but for many they begin quite other contexts. And then they're brought into the classroom to maybe acquire a more defined form, right? A more explicit form. I think the questions may begin earlier and be more existential for those who find themselves out of sync with dominant norms. It becomes a pressing question if you yourself are judged to be on the wrong side. But I think all of us, regardless of how we're positioned, do come to points where we question and wonder, and sometimes we're reaffirmed. Right? The questioning and wondering can come back to a strong reaffirmation of our commitments and convictions, but also to various forms of transformation. In a very important respect, ethics is not for specialists. It's for everyone. No one gets off the hook by saying, I never took a course in that. Right? Oh, sorry. So then you might ask, well, what does an ethics course do for you then? If you have to do ethics all the time in the course of your life, when you bump up against these uncomfortable questions about whether what you've taken to be good and right and just truly is, so why an ethics course? Well, Lovin's answer to this is that it can help organize your thinking. It can help provide a vocabulary for some questions that you are probably already asking and show you how others have dealt with those same questions in the past. And I think that's probably pretty realistic in terms of what an ethics course can do for you. And I wouldn't underestimate the importance of that in terms of how it can equip you going forward. Equip you for better ethical reflection, equip you to be able to find your way forward in the face of disorienting experiences ethically, and find your way forward respectfully in the context of ethical disagreements and strongly felt commitments that collide. So we're not surprised these days at religious pluralism, religious disagreement. We accept that as a fact of human existence. But we sometimes act as though we should all be on the same page when it comes to ethics. If ethics is reflection on how to live given the way the world is, then we should expect ethics to vary depending on how we take the world to be. We should expect ethics to vary if we think God is doing things in the world and what those things what we take those things to be. We should expect ethics to vary according to our understanding of who we are, what it is to be human, what it is to inhabit a world that is more than human. So ethical ideas are always situated. They're always from some point of view, some perspective. There is no plain ethics. There is no just ethics without a qualifier. So what we bring into this conversation is increasing awareness of the qualifiers and what they do to shape our sense of the answer to these fundamental questions. Who are we to be, and who are we to be as individuals and in community in response to what we take the world to be and what we take God to be doing? And the stakes are high if we think about the examples with which we began. Stakes are high for our planet. The stakes are high for our political societies. We really urgently need to be doing this thinking as well as we possibly can.